Ladies and gentlemen, this is Joe. Not just any average Joe, or Sleepy Joe, or Naughty Basement Joe, but Hobo Joe. And you may be wondering, how did Hobo Joe end up like this? Well, I'm going to give you a brief backstory before telling you how Hobo Joe saved the Commonwealth. Joe was once a very happy-go-lucky guy. He had a wife, a child, the perfect life after retiring from the army. But as the threat of nuclear war loomed over America at this period in time, Joe was wondering how he was going to keep his family safe. Until one day, a man knocks on the door, and this man was from Vault-Tec. He was there to offer Joe and his family a place in Vault 111, all thanks to Joe's service history with the army. By this point, a few days had gone by, and then out of nowhere, their Mr. Handy robot calls them all through to the living room because there's a news broadcast that tells them that the attack is imminent. So without a second thought, Joe takes his family and runs to Vault 111. Whilst waiting to go down into the vault, there's an almighty blinding flash, followed by a ball of fire. Joe now knows the nuke has gone off. Once inside the vault, they're quickly ushered into cryopods to be frozen, but they don't know how long for. Some time goes by, but Joe's not entirely sure how long, but he is awoken to see his wife struggling to keep hold of her son, while a bald man points a gun at her. Unfortunately, she catches a bullet with her teeth and gets sent back to the lobby. From this day forth, Joe vowed to find the nonce who took his child and also killed his wife. So now here we are, 200 years into the future. After no doubt being exposed to some form of radiation and being frozen for 200 years and a little bit defrosted during that time, Joe now looks like a mouldy old piece of beef that's been lost at the back of the freezer for the past 30 years. Upon leaving the vault and realising that he is now homeless, Joe has fully become Hobo Joe. Upon getting his bearings, Joe quickly pulls himself together and runs off in search of some sort of salvation, and to see whether he can find anyone living on the surface. Joe first stumbles across the old red rocket station situated not too far from his old home in Sanctuary Hills. He is also then greeted by a stray dog. This dog is now known as Dog Meat, and Joe will take him with him everywhere he goes throughout the wasteland. Joe then runs back to Sanctuary to see if his house is still standing, and to his surprise, it still is. But what's even more surprising is that his old Mr. Handy, Codsworth, is still alive. Joe then proceeds to tell Codsworth why he looks like Kermit the Frog's finger after it's been inside Miss Piggy. Oh, and he also tells him Sean has been kidnapped and Nora is dead. Codsworth, understandably, is absolutely devastated to know about this, so then Joe decides to ask him if he's seen anyone come through. Codsworth tells him no, but does tell him to go look in Concord in case there's anyone still alive there. As he arrives in Concord, he's met with the sound of gunfire. Joe, instinctively, once being in the army, follows this gunfire and finds that there's a friendly group of raiders firing at the Museum of Freedom. But there is also someone firing back from the Museum of Freedom, and then this person asks Joe to come inside and help clear out the raiders and get to them to help them. After fighting his way through all the raiders, Joe is finally met with a man named Preston Garvey, who informs him he is part of the Minutemen. They tell Joe about their tragic backstory and start trauma dumping on him, but Joe's not interested. Joe just wants to find his son and find the man who killed his wife. He does, however, offer to help them get out of the Museum of Freedom so that they can relocate at Sanctuary to start rebuilding. And then in return, they will help him find his son and his wife's killer. One of Joe's first tasks was to put an end to the beast more ugly than he was, so that the travellers could roam freely throughout the wasteland. After doing that, Joe took himself back inside the Museum of Freedom, where everyone was waiting downstairs for his arrival. He told them all the coast was clear and that they could start moving over to Sanctuary. This is where the little local crackhead pipes up and tells Joe she knows where his son is. For the small amount of help that Joe's already offered, she tells him to go to Diamond City and start looking from there, which she won't give him any more information unless she gets her hands on more crack. Joe finally makes it to Diamond City and is currently sat face to face with Detective Nick Valentine and his lovely assistant Ellie. He's then asked to give all the details about his son, how he went missing, and about the man who is behind the dastardly scheme. He then gives him a brief description: bald, scar across his face, really cool gun that he recognises from The Walking Dead, and some pretty neat armour that he would also like to pick up once he's killed him. Nick then informs Joe that this sounds like the work of Kellogg, who conveniently has a house here in Diamond City. So without a second thought, they both make their way over to his house. Once inside Kellogg's house, Joe and Nick quickly discover that Kellogg has not been there for a long time, but they do however find a button under his desk for a secret sex dungeon. As they entered the dungeon, it was very clear to see that Kellogg was a very unkept man. Magazines all over the place, dirty used tissues all over the place, and we know what they were for. They also discovered some San Francisco Sunlight cigars. Joe knew back from his army days that there's only one place that these could come from. Not just San Francisco, but Fort Hagen. After leaving Kellogg's house, Joe took Dog Meat and made a beeline straight for Fort Hagen. Once Joe and Dogmeat arrived at Fort Hagen, they were tasked with fighting their way through the robots from iRobot that were also crossed with the T-Series robots from Terminator. Putting all of his army skills to the test under a new enemy that Joe had never met before, he managed to successfully fight his way through what were known as synths. After fighting his way through all of the synths, Joe is finally met face to face with Kellogg. After asking where his son is, Kellogg replies, "The Institute." Completely unhappy with his answer, Joe uses his pent-up rage and anger to set Kellogg on fire and then cave his head in with a tire iron. Now with Kellogg's corpse roasting away like a chestnut on an open fire, Joe could finally get the whereabouts of the Institute and Sean, his son. Joe then returns to Diamond City to go and see Nick and tell Nick the good news and also the bad news. Obviously the good news being he knows where Sean is, the bad news is he doesn't know how to get inside the Institute to find him. Whilst trying to tell Nick all of this stuff that's going on, local news reporter Piper tries sticking her nose in where it doesn't belong. But then Nick is able to tell Joe that there's a place called Good Neighbor and there's someone there that might be able to help called Dr. Amari. Joe then quickly rushes himself over to Good Neighbor and makes his way over to a place called the Memory Den. Once inside the Memory Den, Joe goes to see Dr. Amari and he hands Dr. Amari the brain chip that he stole from Kellogg after he killed him. She inserts the brain chip into a computer and quickly deciphers all the codes and signals to find out that the only way in and out of the Institute is teleportation, and the only person who knows how to build a teleportation device is a doctor that was once part of the Institute but now lives in the glowing sea because he was forced to move out there once being exposed to the FEV as punishment for trying to out the Institute for their experiments with children. But Joe being Joe didn't mind that he had to cross the glowing sea. He's already been exposed to enough radiation because he looks like a mouldy piece of beef, so he was more than happy to make the journey. After travelling across the glowing sea and fighting every irradiated creature known to man, Joe finally made it to Dr. Virgil. Virgil then proceeds to tell Joe about what he needs to do to build the teleporter, and one of the things is to find a Corsa chip located inside a synth. And this synth is located in Green Tech Genetics. Joe had heard about this building because it's absolutely filled to the brim with gunners. So once Joe had travelled back across the glowing sea, he made his way over to Green Tech Genetics. After discovering his new addiction to Psychojet and Psychobuff, Joe was able to absolutely power his way through Green Tech Genetics to finally get to the Corsa. During the battle with the Corsa tried to turn himself invisible, but it was no use because Joe, being a juiced up hobo, caved the Corsa's head in and made it explode with a tire iron. Now with the Corsa chip in hand, Joe had to make his way over to a little known faction called the Railroad because someone there called Tinker Tom was able to decipher the actual signal that the Institute was sending out so that Joe could teleport himself in. With the chip deciphered and the coordinates received, it was time for Joe to huff some more chems and make his way back across the glowing sea back to Virgil. Now that Joe was stood back in front of the man that looks like he's covered in bogies, Virgil gave him the plans for a signal interceptor which should help him get inside the Institute. So with his tire iron in hand, Joe now had to make a decision. Which faction will he side with? Joe had ultimately decided that to get his son back, the Minutemen were the best option. With the teleporter built, it was now time for Joe to take the leap into the unknown and find out what was really going on inside the Institute. After making his way through the facility after being spoken to by someone called Father, he finally reached a cage, and inside this cage was his son, Sean. Sean was absolutely horrified by the sight of Joe, but it's understandable. Who wouldn't be scared of a man who looks like a mouldy piece of beef that's been taking drugs for the past 300 years? Once Sean had stopped finished screaming for help, a man appeared through a door. The man who is known as Father. Joe immediately starts to scream at this man, asking where his son is and that he really wants his son back, only for this man to turn around and give Joe the real harsh truth that he is actually the real Sean. In all of his anger and his confusion, Joe really doesn't know what to do, so he takes a hit of some chems, and in all of his anger, he kills his own son. Joe quickly realises the mistake that he's made, and realises that he has to hightail it out of there quick before any of the security guards get a hold of him. Now that Joe's made it out of the Institute safely, he runs back to Preston Garvey to ask for help, because Joe wants to lead an assault on the Institute, bringing them down once and for all. Preston agrees to this and they start work on their battle plan. With the battle plan now ready, it was time to infiltrate the Institute for one last final time. Joe had to jump onto the roof to talk to Sturgis about how to get back into the Institute because for some reason he was just stood up there. Sturgis proceeded to tell Joe that the only way in was through an old pipe that takes water to their reactor. So without hesitation, Joe made his way to the river where he could find the old pipe to swim through to get inside the institute. With his upgraded tire iron in hand, it was now time for Joe to start fighting his way through all of the synths, the same ones that he had to fight when he fought Kellogg. After fighting his way back through to the control room, it was time to get the Minutemen teleported in. Joe did this with ease as he'd already done it before, and now with the Minutemen teleported in, the real onslaught could begin. Joe had to fight his way through to a reactor and place a fusion pulse charge on it, and once that was on, they could exit the institute and blow it up remotely. After fighting his way through a lot more synths, Joe finally made it to the reactor, and for one last time, Joe took a hit of Psycho Jet, placed the charge, and knew that it was then time to leave. But before leaving, Joe had a choice to make. Does he take Synth Sean with him, or does he leave him here with the institute to be blown up? He decides to take him with him because he knows that if he does, he can get himself clean from the chems and be the father he always wanted to be for Sean. He'll always know in the back of his mind that this isn't really his actual son, but he'll always see it as a second chance, a brand new start. He can go back to Sanctuary and rebuild their family home. Joe also had the realization that he is now no longer Hobo Joe or mouldy piece of beef Joe. He's now just back to being regular Joe. But before any of that could happen, he knows he has to get out of the institute and blow it up once and for all. Now back outside of the institute, it was time to activate the detonator. Joe watched on as a swirl of blue started to erupt from underground, followed by an absolutely enormous explosion of the nuclear kind. Joe watched on as the explosion unfolded. His only regret was killing his actual son, but having Synth Sean wasn't too bad. He can now return to his normal life, or as normal as it can be in a nuclear wasteland. Joe could now return to being the happy-go-lucky guy he once was 200 years ago. And this also proves that you can beat Fallout 4 as a hobo. Thank you all for being patient with me while I made this video. I know it's been a while since I uploaded. I've had a lot of real-life stuff going on that kind of took priority. But if you have watched all of this video and you have enjoyed it, thank you. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and a comment on what video I should probably do next in this sort of style, because I've actually really enjoyed making this one. I did the Grognak one as well. If you haven't seen that, go and check that out. And I'll be back again soon with another video. I love you all. Thank you again very much. And goodbye.